Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1015th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Debra Bricker Balken, Lynn Gumpert, and Eleanor Heartney. And now I'll introduce our guests and host. Debra Bricker Balken is an award-winning independent curator, scholar, and writer who has assembled numerous exhibitions on subjects relating to American modernism and contemporary art for major museums internationally. Her recent publications include Arthur Dove, a Catalogue Raisonné of paintings and things, Harold Rosenberg, A Critic's Life, and Alex Katz, Collaborations with Poets. Museum director, curator, administrator, and art historian Lynn Gumpert has overseen and organized exhibitions on 4 continents. For more than 25 years, she has served as director of NYU's Gray Art Museum, formerly known as Gray Art Gallery. During her tenure, the Gray has presented over 75 exhibitions. The French government honored Gumpert with the distinction of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters in 1999. And our host today, New York-based art critic Eleanor Heartney, is the author of numerous books on contemporary art. Heartney is a contributor to Art in America, Art Press, and ArtNet, and has written extensively for publications including Art News, The New Art Examiner, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Her most recent book, Mothers of Invention, The Feminist Roots of Contemporary Art, is just out today. Congratulations on that, Eleanor. And we are so lucky to have her as an editor at large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Eleanor.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor. Okay, so today, our conversation today, of course, is around the new exhibition at the Gray Art Museum, Americans in Paris. But I also want to just say that the Gray Art Museum is new. I mean, this is and congratulations to you, Lynn, on this. This is, I think, quite a long time in the making, but fabulous new location, fabulous new space, and this is a remarkable exhibition that's filling it. So congratulations also to you and Debra for putting this together. I think it was something like 7 years in the making. So let's talk, I guess, well, let's begin at the beginning. And maybe the two of you could talk about how this came about. Why did you feel, that this was a show that needed to be done?
Well, I'll start off and then turn it over to Debra, but I remember very clearly and very distinctly, it was right after we'd opened the fascinating exhibition, Inventing Downtown, that Melissa Ratcliffe had done for the Gray about artists who had started their own studios, cooperative studios in the early 50s. And one thing I learned from that show was that a number of artists had come back from Paris, for example, Al Held and Ed Clark, to join the Bratta Gallery. And we were talking about that. Debra had just come back from installing the Toby show and doing the Toby show for the Venice Biennale at the Peggy Guggenheim Foundation. And quickly, 10 or 15 other names came immediately to our heads, like Norman Bloom and Ellsworth Kelly and Joan Mitchell, et cetera. So we were thinking about all these artists in Paris, and we're wondering, what that situation was like. Debra?
Yeah, as Lynn mentioned, I had just come back from Venice after having installed the Mark Toby retrospective at the Peggy Guggenheim collection. And during the course of my research, I became struck by the number of Americans, including Toby, who were in Paris during the decade of the 50s. And as Lynn and I walked around Inventing Downtown, we just began to enumerate some of the figures that she mentioned, who had been in and out of the city for upwards of a 6-year period. So that was one of my avenues to to Americans in Paris. The other was I was researching the intellectual biography on Harold Rosenberg that was brought out a couple of years ago. And again, just struck by the number of American writers who were also in Paris during this period of time. Rosenberg was the New York correspondent for Les Temps Modernes, the publication that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir launched in 1944, just after the occupation of Paris. And he didn't arrive in Paris actually until about 3 years after his own appointment to the publication. But there were as many writers as there were artists, and there are some overlap that we actually explore in this publication, the accompanying publication for this exhibition.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting that in a way this show is about a certain paradox, which is the fact that you have, after the Second World War, all of these artists coming to Paris at a moment when kind of the shift in the art world is back to New York. So they're sort of going against the grain in a way in the other direction. And that I think is kind of fascinating. And can you talk a little bit about why they would choose to go, to Paris at a time when many other artists were coming to New York?
Well, first of all, the GI Bill was implemented in 1944, a year before the armistice or the end of World War II. And many of the figures in our exhibition traveled to Paris on the bill as of 1946. It wasn't up and running until 1946, in part because Paris was still experiencing severe rationing, and the American embassy didn't want to expose veterans, especially to that situation. So they started to travel to Paris in 46. They were given $75 a month, which was a great deal of money to live on in Paris at that time. It allowed them accommodations in either hotels or small apartments. They could live for the equivalent of $1 a day. And if they also received a $25 book allowance every month. And if they traveled with a spouse, they got an extra $25. Now, the one stipulation was that they had to enroll in a school or an atelier, which they did. And it was much easier to enroll in a school in Paris than apply to an American university or school and wait to see if you were admitted.
And I know you, in the book, you tell some kind of amusing stories about how a lot of them sort of avoided actually going to these schools. They, that it was required for their funding, but, they really wanted to soak up Paris.
Right.
Yes, I mean, I think an important factor for Paris, being so prominent in terms of Americans deciding to use their GI Bill there was the fact that a lot of them had served in Europe and had come to Paris or had had experiences. And for many of the soldiers or the GIs, it was the first time, and Paris is magical. I mean, there is a reason why Paris dominated the art world for so long. The light, then there were the museums, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think some of the GIs just said it's, Paris is romantic. We are very fortunate in the book to have excerpted interviews that were conducted with a number of the artists by Billy Kluver and Julie Martin as research for a book and they taped these artists in the 90s and extracted from these longer interviews the parts of the interview where the artists were talking about their experiences in Paris. What's so interesting is you have such a wide range of artists. You have artists who've studied for a while and are, as Debra said, taking advantage of not really going to the schools or finding the schools that useful, but instead the freedom to just paint all day, either in their small apartments or in their hotel rooms, or sometimes to sculpt within the various studios and academies. So we read somewhere, I'm still trying to remember exactly where, that there were over 400 GIs. I think my feeling is now that was probably generally 400 GIs who went to study literature or other aspects of, not just art, because they can enroll in any school. But so that was it for Paris. We came across 250 names of artists. And I think it's important to start out early on. And once we realized that there was such a great number of artists going, we decided to focus on artists who went for the first time to Paris after World War II, because then you wouldn't have to deal with all the artists like Calder and others who went, before the war and then returned after the war. And we thought it made sense to focus on those artists who stayed at least 1 year.
Yeah.
Of course, Rauschenberg went, but he was there for 6 months. Helen Frankenthaler went, it was for weeks on end. So the idea was who were the artists, who were the Americans who picked up and moved and stayed for at least 1 year.
Right.
And it wasn't just GIs, though. I mean, I think we should also emphasize that. One of the things that's also fascinating about the show, there's a lot of women. Also, I mean, one of the attractions, I think, there's quite a few African-American artists as well. And I think part of the attraction there had to do with, I guess, escaping the racial prejudice of the United States. Do you want to talk a little bit about the appeal to Paris? Because I think it was different for those different groups. That the African Americans, the women, and then the white GIs kind of had different, I think, experiences in many ways.
Right. Well, for instance, Joan Mitchell was one of the earliest women to travel to Paris. She travels to Paris in 1948, stays a year and a half, and then will be in and out of Paris until the late 1950s. She's there on her own dime. Shirley Jaffe went with her husband, who was on the GI Bill. He was a journalist / writer, and she ended up spending her entire life there. Whereas Claire Falkenstein was an interesting case in that she was from the Bay Area, a very established artist actually in San Francisco, had exhibited routinely at the San Francisco Art Institute, but had very little interest in New York. She felt that, New York had very little to offer her. So she will go around 1950. Then some of our African-American figures in the show, like Ed Clark, of course, are on the GI Bill, Harold Cousins, and then Shinkichi Tajiri, the Japanese-American artist who will travel again in 1950, a very, very poignant story that perhaps epitomizes what you're alluding to, Eleanor, and that is he was interned in one of the relocation camps in Southern California, and the only way that he could get out of the camp was to enlist in the army. He is placed in the 442nd Squadron, which was known as the Yankee Samurai, immediately sent to the front, injured, and sent to a Parisian hospital where he recovers, comes back to the United States, enrolls in the Art Institute of Chicago, and is subjected to such racism that he returns to Paris, where he feels he is welcomed.
And, maybe we can, I don't know if in the slideshow, if we can get to his work, because to me, that was one of the real revelations of the show. I mean, there's some amazing, first of all, there's a number of artists in the show who I was totally not familiar with. So you're introducing them. And then, of course, there are a lot of well-known artists whose work is so uncharacteristic of what we're used to. But if we could get to Tajiri, I don't know if that's possible. It's such interesting work. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the work, especially if we can find it.
Sure. Well, Tajiri, he was exploring sculpture, and a number of the artists had studied with Zatkin, who was very rigorous in his approach and made people choose one approach or another. Tajiri at that time was experimenting with welding and created these like wire-like figures. There's one reference to a small sculpture called Wounded Knee. And as Deborah's noted, that he did suffer an injury and had to recover. But I think it also goes back to, the wounded knee of Indigenous Americans and Native Americans. So there's a reference in that as well. So he learns to weld and makes these figures, and there's a bit of humor at it, a bit of humor in them. And there's this wonderful, wonderful piece in the show that I think everybody's been taken with, which is a homage to Lady Day, to Billie Holiday. And that brings up the fact that there was so many jazz musicians, African-American jazz musicians, who went to Paris as well. And so I think that, he's one of these figures who adapts to Europe very well and feels a certain freedom. He first marries a French woman, and that marriage doesn't last long. He then marries a Dutch woman, and who's also a fabulous artist. And they end up moving first to Amsterdam, where they get involved with Cobra. And then they move to the countryside. They buy a 18th century manor house with an interior courtyard that they slowly renovate. And it's just, they're very happy there and making sculpture. And Tajiri, I think, comes back only for one visit somewhere in the Midwest.
In Minneapolis, actually, for a year.
Yeah, and then goes back to Europe and never returns. And so I think we can safely say this is the first time this work is ever being exhibited in New York.
Right.
And it was such a fun discovery for Deborah and me. I want to give a shout out also to Valerie Mercer's Catalogue exhibition, The City of Light, with African-American, that focused on African-American artists. I think it was in 1996 or 1997 at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And that pointed us in the direction a lot of the African-American artists, like Harold Cousins. But here now we have the slides on the screen, and you can see these, the Wounded Knee work that I had referenced earlier is on the right of your screen, and the Lament for Lady Day is in the middle. And then you see Tajiri on the street. This is, I think, in front of Gallery Wheat, which was a very important meeting point, and it was started by a bunch of GIs. They weren't having a whole lot of luck getting gallery shows. Some of them participated in the salons, and we'll talk about that later. But there's a photograph in the exhibition of Tajiri, who ended up doing these one-day junk sculptures along the board of the Seine, on the banks of the Seine. And then he would photograph them, and then they would disappear. So there was just a lot of, I think, opportunities. This was post-war Paris after the occupation. There were still lots of struggles, as Deborah mentioned early on, in terms of food lines and so forth. But there was also, I think, a sense that you could do anything, that, you could experiment and you could try. And I think a number of the artists felt there wasn't quite the competitive scene that there was in New York at the time with the second generation of abstract expressionism. So, the abstract expressionist, explosion in the 40s, it created a lot of excitement and a lot of competition.
Right. Well, and one of the things you're sort of alluding to too is they I think in Paris they found there were sort of different groupings in a way, and I think that was very interesting too, the way that, certain artists, they didn't seem to get that involved with the French, and the French were, of course, not that interested in them, but within them, the expat group, sort of these different groups emerged, and, sort of different initiatives like the Gallery Wheat. Yeah, so maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of the whole, topography of these people.
Right. So there are different, yes, there are different groups, different social groups actually, and different aesthetic groups, I would say. So some of those groups are defined by the figures who were members of Gallery Wheat, this artist-run gallery in Paris. And those figures will include, Ed Clark, Elle Held, Oscar Schlemensky, Shirley Jaffe, Sam Francis, and many such figures. We don't know how long the gallery actually operated for. There are very few archives that exist on this noted institution, although we've just in the past 2 days come across somebody who seems to have all of their records, which is very interesting.
Wow.
Another group will constitute Ellsworth Kelly, Jack Youngerman, Ralph Coburn, William Klein, and to a lesser extent, Carmen Herrera. And then figures other figures who congregated together include Claire Falkenstein, Mark Toby. Toby was actually lured to Paris by Claire Falkenstein, who started to correspond with him in the mid to early 50s. After she got to Paris, she'd seen his work in various noted European collections and asked him to come and consider making Paris his base. She was also a noted hostess. She was evidently a fabulous cook. So her apartment became a meeting place for many of these people, which would also include people like Paul Jenkins, as well as some French figures, most notably the French art critic Michel Tapier, who was one of the few French critics who was actually deeply interested in the American expat scene in Paris. And then of course, there's Joan Mitchell, Sam Francis, Shirley Jaffe, Kimber Smith, who will form their own social group. And towards the end of the exhibition, Leon Golub, Nancy Spiro, and Peter Saul. But again, there's also overlap with some of these other figures too.
Yeah. And I think one of the questions too, that maybe for the artists themselves and for the French was, what's the Americanness of this work? And I know there's a discussion in the book about Toby and the whole notion of, was there like a Pacific, a West Coast American school? So this question of Americanness, how do you feel that was important to these artists, or did they make them feel more American in a way to be out of America?
Well, I can give you a couple of examples. The first example that comes to mind is Elle Held. So Elle Held will travel to Paris in the early 50s on the GI Bill, become involved in the Gallery Wheat scene. But in 1952, Jackson Pollock's first one-person exhibition will be scored at another alternative space, the Studio Fischetti, and he will see that exhibition and he will sense that something is deeply alive in New York and he wants to return. Toby, however, had been in and out of Paris from the late 20s into the early 1950s, was somebody who resisted being dubbed an American. This was also the time that Harold Rosenberg had just written his American action painters, and action had really become the metaphor for the decade of the 50s. It was a term that Toby resisted. But when he was in Paris and he assessed what existed of the contemporary scene, he decided, yes, I am an American and I want to go home.
Yeah. So it was kind of paradoxical. Lynn,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the other group that was there and with whom the artists interacted were all the writers. There was James Baldwin and Richard Wright, and then there were the Beats that came over as well. William Gardner Smith, another writer. So, there were many discussions. And I think, when you are abroad, you often do feel, what are the differences? Oh, they do this differently. They don't do it like this. And a lot of them began to question what it meant to be an American. And I think that was very important. And then, and on the other hand, there were those that just stayed. We mentioned Shinkichi Tajiri never came back to the US. Harold Cousins, who's on the screen now, ended up in Sweden.
No, in Normandy. It's Herbert Gentry.
No, oh, Herbert Gentry, sorry, you're in Sweden, you're absolutely
Yeah.
correct. So, there was these other solutions. I mean, James Bishop, who was one of the artists one of the last artists to come over and stay, he ended up in the countryside south of Paris. So there were these different approaches. I think Shirley Jaffe remained in Paris itself. But everybody, and then there were those artists who married French women, for the most part. So Jack Youngerman marries Delphine Seyrig, and she actually comes back with him when they settle in Coenty Slip. William Klein marries a French woman and gets established there and doesn't ever come back. He comes back for short periods to New York, but his children are born there. So this is a good time also to mention that the first part of the exhibition, or the focus part of the exhibition, is looking at these 24 artists a little in depth with 2 or 3 works by each. But because the scene was so big and there were so many, we wanted to really highlight the diversity of approaches and the diversity of the kinds of artists. And so we have a salon section, which is in the middle of the 2 focus sections, or biparted. And that was just, again, to show that there is this tradition in Paris that had existed since the 17th century, continues after the war. It starts up again. And these are artists standing on line, ready to hang their works. And so there were, a couple of salons that, as Deborah mentioned earlier, but there was the Salon de la Jeune Peinture, the salon for young painters, the salon for young sculptors. There was the Salon de Mai, there was the Salon d'automne, this fall autumn, and there was the Salon des Réalités Nouvelles, which was very much a salon that was geared towards artists working in a geometric, hard-edged approach. So a lot of the Americans ended up in 1 or 2 of the salons, or showing at Studio Wheat. And then there was, some of them were very, very enterprising. Ellsworth Kelly and Jack Youngerman convinced a couple who owned a bookstore on Rue de Dragon to allow them to paint the cave, to paint the basement white. I think they said it took 3 or 4 coats of white paint. But that's where Ellsworth Kelly and Jack Youngerman have their first solo shows. So, as Americans, I think they were also very eager to come up with and take hold of the situation and come up with solutions.
Yeah.
So we should also point out too that very, very few of these artists actually sold any work in Paris. Very few of them attained gallery representation, with the exception of figures like Sam Francis and Claire Falkenstein, who will show with Gallery Rive Droite, and also Robert Brier, who will show with Denise René. But very, very little of this work sold. And you can imagine how costly it was to ship this work back home, after their sojourns in Paris were over. So it accounts for, in some instances, very little work from this period by many of these artists. And part of Lynn and my mandate was to acquire work for this exhibition that was actually painted or sculpted in Paris, so that we reinforce the kind of authenticity of our premise.
But it sounds like it was probably kind of a treasure hunt too. I mean, how did you manage to locate some of this work?
With great difficulty. I mean, some of the artists.
Research.
Yeah, a lot of research. So Debbie, you should talk about some of the archives you visited.
Yeah, I mean, there were numerous archives that were visited for this project. I mean, I always rely upon the deep resources of the Archives of American Art for all of my projects, and many of these artist papers are with the Archives of American Art. I also visited the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles for to consult papers, as well as a phenomenal facility in Normandy called EMEC, where papers relating to Nancy Spiro and Leon Golub and Peter Saul's exhibitions in Paris resided. We also had a team of fabulous graduate research assistants who worked alongside of us. And lo and behold, we came up with this, I think, really remarkable checklist.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could, we've talked about Tajiri, but some of the other kind of discoveries that you made that, really, people we really have not known anything about. I mean, what were some of the most surprising discoveries that you made?
Well, for me, one was Coburn. Debra knew a little bit about him and introduced him to me, but Ralph Coburn was went over from Boston. He knew Ellsworth Kelly and they had a relationship, and he would come back and forth a bit. But I find his work spectacular, and I wasn't aware of it, even though he was taught for many years at MIT, but in typography. And another one I'll quickly mention before Debra was Robert Breer, who participated in the Salon de Réalité Nouvelle, started getting involved with kinetic art and started making films. And I actually had seen the first piece by him at the Centre Pompidou, and it was one of his animated abstract films. And I fell, head over heels. It was just so charming and so wonderful. And then I realized he made sculpture as well and showed with Denise René, and then came back and taught at the Cooper Union for many years. So, I mean, that was fantastic to realize that he was such an amazing painter, as well as an amazing filmmaker. And I will say that there will be an evening of his films that will be shown at the Anthology Film Archives, and all of our programs are listed on our website. So you can still go to either Great Art Gallery or Great Art Museum. I think we're in transition trying to get all the URLs lined up and so forth, but we do have a list.
Mm-hmm. And Debra, what about you?
Well, those are my revelations too, but I would also say that, within, a specific artist's oeuvre, I mean, just thinking about a figure like William Klein, who's better known as a photographer, and recently ICP here in New York, devoted a retrospective to his work, but who knew that he started out as a painter in Paris? And there are these very interesting aesthetic crossovers and links between his photography and painting. Also, just to go back to Ralph Coburn, Coburn's work operates what he refers to as by choice, meaning that one of the pieces in the exhibition is actually something, we're not allowing it, but something that you could move around, manipulate. And he was exploring chance operations at precisely the same time that John Cage was. He meets Cage in Paris with Kelly and Merce Cunningham, who are all staying at the same hotel. And they begin to discuss these kinds of chance or choice operations. But the sad thing is again, as Lynn mentioned, Coburn returns to Boston and rather than to New York. And it's part of the reason why his career has been totally eclipsed until hopefully now.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's sort of interesting about the show too, is that it kind of raises the question of history and how does history get made and how do we understand history? Because, some of these artists who are very, very strong, and yet, why did they disappear? Why are they not? Why do we not know them, or why have we not known them before? So what do you think that this show tells us, or will it change our sense of history? What sort of its larger impact on our understanding of art history?
Well, I think people, I think it's been recognized for a long while now that, these movements that we study in art history are not, the only things that go on in any one period. There's always a variety of approaches that take place over time. Certain artists get identified and singled out, and certain movements get singled out, but there's always a huge range. I think since the 40s and the ascendancy of the New York School and the dominance of American painting, we Americans have tended to have blinders on and are not aware of the super rich history that continued to be made within Europe. And I think there's more interest now in looking at these figures and what was going on. I mean, I personally have always been fascinated with the post-European art, and did a show back in, I think it was 1996, about contemporary European artists from Belgium and Holland and Germany. Kind of looking at this is on the screen now, is a great picture of Shinkichi Tajiri and some of his outdoor sculptures. I mean, I think what's interesting too is that if you stay on this slide for a little bit, we found artists like Joe Downing, who's in the salon section, who makes, it's very hard to see from this image, but makes these very charming little collages with staples. We encountered Ruth Franken, who moves to Paris and then lives for a while in Venice and then moves back to Paris and remains in Paris her life, and is very frank, pardon the pun, about her status being a woman in Europe, and you know how critics tend to talk about her appearance and not so much about her work. There's a wonderful artist named Leo Zimmerman who does these abstract compositions, hard-edged abstract compositions, who was friends with Breuer and a circle of those artists who are just really, really good artists. And, you know, it's sometimes just luck. It's sometimes introduction. It's sometimes, you know, just a passion and an ability to promote oneself. So, you know, this has always been the case. And it's certainly the case with the group of artists who have, you know, who are included in the show here.
Right. You know, I would also add that during the decade of the 50s, as the American economy is becoming extraordinarily buoyant, and by the end of the decade of the 50s, there will be a proliferation of commercial galleries in this country, unlike France, and a whole group of new collectors who are buying American art will, you know, account for part of the reason that Paris becomes, you know, overshadowed. You know, I would also add too that I think in terms of the critical reception to American art in New York, it becomes, you know, streamlined by formalist analysis. And so that in and of itself will exclude so many figures and only focus on a handful of men, very few women, if women at all. Be focused on one media, painting, will exclude sculpture with the exception of David Smith, and will not admit photography. So that tells you something else. And so that, you know, that critical analysis becomes, you know, allied in some ways with American political might too. We all know that story.
Well, and you know, in a way, this exhibition too, maybe you can both talk about how this aligns, doing the show aligns with your other interests. And, you know, for you, Debra, you know, and your interest in Rosenberg, which is again, you know, about kind of rewriting that history and opening up that history. And of course your work on Mark Tobey as well. And for you, Lynn, I mean, you talk in the, I think in the introductory essay about your own personal experiences of being an expat, of going to Paris. So maybe you could both talk a little bit about sort of what personally, you know, this show meant for you.
Well, I'll go in first because I was a student and younger. But I ended up studying my junior year abroad in Paris and was not accepted I was in college at Berkeley at the time. And ended up going to Paris on my own and enrolling at the École du Louvre, and ended up and then enrolling in les cours de la civilisation française, que de la langue de la civilisation, which was a branch of the Sorbonne which taught foreigners how to speak French. And it was fantastic. It was fantastic studying at the Louvre. I had grown up in San Francisco, and, you know, the museums at that point, there was no comparison between the museums in San Francisco and the museums in Paris. I mean, the Louvre was such an eye-opener, and to be able to actually study while in the Louvre and eat in the workers' cafeteria was fantastic. And maybe because I'm first generation American, I had always been curious again about post-war French art, especially after I had done this exhibition of young European artists. So, I mean, the thing that struck me again was, you know, it was a very different thing to get an apartment on your own. You have to get a new telephone line in Paris. It still took a 3-year wait. You just couldn't sign up and get a telephone, which points to, again, some of the challenges, the GIs. So I was there in 71, 72, so it was a decade later, but there were still issues, still things to overcome from the occupation as France got back and recovered from this devastating occupation. So I think, you know, that was my comment earlier also about realizing that things are done differently, you know, which is so basic to a student's understanding, and also just really realizing that food could be so much better than what you were getting in the US.
And Debra, for you, I mean, I think it aligns very well with so many of the things that you've been working on over the years. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, Toby being one of the catalysts, the exhibition that I worked on for over a decade, actually, before that actually opened at the in Venice at the Guggenheim collection, you know, a figure who got to the forefront of abstraction, to all over abstraction, as we call it, before Jackson Pollock. We know that Pollock saw Toby's work in 1944 at his exhibition at the Marion Willard Gallery, goes back into his studio, and then begins to create, you know, all over compositions. I'd always been curious, you know, why Toby had been overshadowed by Pollock, and there were reasons. I mean, Toby would never commit to this country, living in various European capitals, as well as in a place like Seattle, excluded him from a lot of critical analysis, which deeply intrigued me. And curiously, when I started my research on Harold Rosenberg's first review for the New Yorker was on Toby's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1962. He didn't have a very favorable take on Toby, but I overlooked his dim analysis because I thought that he was somebody that, you know, really should be pulled back. But, you know, of course, you know, Rosenberg's more contextual take on art also deeply, deeply fascinated me. And during the course of this exhibition, you know, Rosenberg does appear infrequently in my essay, as well as chronology. And one thing that also struck me about Rosenberg was not only his connection with a very, very prominent, you know, French journal, Les Temps Modernes, but also in 1962, he writes this amazing essay in which he talks about the new international art and globalism. Now, who was using the word globalism in 1962? It's such a prescient term. And so it also came to nicely frame this exhibition chronologically, because our end date is also in 62 for a multiple of reasons. One is the year that Algeria gains its independence from France. Second is the year that Ileana Sonnabend is beginning to show pop art and proto-pop art in Paris. So the whole reception to American art begins to shift from New York-based abstraction to, again, this new pop art that is emerging. And so the interest in pop art, in abstract expressionism rather, will begin to recede in Paris around this time, after there had been multiple huge exhibitions that had toured Europe that were largely organized by the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art. And then thirdly, part of our end date is attributed to the new emergence of cheap air travel. Many of our subjects, all of our subjects actually had to take a 10-day boat ride from New York to Paris. That was a huge commitment. So after 62, when airfare becomes more reasonable, they can travel to Europe and to Paris for shorter periods of time and retain their base in New York.
Yeah. And when they came back, when the artists who did come back, some of them, as you say, stayed or went to other places, what did they find? How you've talked a little bit about how a number of them ended up in Coente's slip, and that's, of course, now has been a subject of a new book and a lot of study. But what happened when they came back, and what did they bring, I guess, with them from France when they came back?
Well, I think if you look at people like Ken Noland and Al Held, I think they came with a new confidence to maybe develop their own approach and not follow necessarily the more linear or painterly. It was not linear, but more painterly. Because you can see here that Ken Noland, there's, echoes of surrealism, there's echoes of a very painterly approach. And, obviously he eventually develops his hard edge approach. And the same thing with, with El Held. I think they stayed there Nolan was 1 year. I think El Held was 2 years. But I think there was, in my mind, and Deborah, what do you think? A kind of new confidence. They had negotiated a different art world and they were ready to kind of find their own approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think, an example to point to is that of Ellsworth Kelly. So Kelly stays in Paris, for 6 years. He runs out of his GI benefits. He becomes a janitor at the American embassy to support himself. But during that, so that, just underscores his commitment to living in Paris. But at one point, he discovers a reproduction of Ad Reinhardt in Art News. And that intrigues him. And it also intrigues him that Ad Reinhardt's work is shown at Betty Parsons' gallery. So for him, it's time to return home. But as Lynn mentioned, with a very, very confident body of work behind him.
Right. And this, were they able to bring that work back? Was he able to bring the work back? Because you were saying for a lot of the artists, it was difficult for them, I guess, to bring it back.
I think it was different in each situation. It just depended. If you were on ship, you could, pack up and bring as many as you wanted. We were, this is something we still need to tease out. One thing is we were just really taken aback about how much still needs to be researched. There was, and I think, are at the tip of the iceberg, but there's so much more. Some artists like Jules Zalitsky destroyed all the work before he came back. Romare Bearden went over for a year, but he just studied at the Louvre. So those were two artists we couldn't include because they hadn't made any work. And then, but happily, there are enough, the artists in the show had, work survived. Some of the work was borrowed from Europe because that's where they stayed. Like Shinkichi Tajiri's work came from the Netherlands. We borrowed one of the James Bishops from the National Center of Art in Paris. And likewise with an artist like Ruth Franken, where we, who ended up staying in Paris. We couldn't find any works here. So it was kind of, each situation was different.
And you were just mentioning that this show opens up a lot of new avenues of investigation. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Where you see, what happens now that you put this show together? What's the next thing that needs to be looked at, or what are some of these loose ends?
Well, there had been a couple of shows before us. There was a show that Serge Guilbeault had done about all the foreigners in Paris. So he didn't limit it to Americans, but Paris remained a really important vital center. And there were a lot of, I know, artists from the Arab world who went there. And I know that from our collections of Turkish art, Iranian art, a lot of Iranians, a lot of Turks, a number of Indian artists had moved to Paris during this period. I think that there are, still more artists to discover who came back to just bring it back into the discourse for having done remarkable work like Leo Zimmerman, and, researched these, or Joe Downing, and see what else they did. And then there's a show that the Pompidou Paris is preparing now, which overlaps with our show, called Paris Noir. So they're going to be looking at the whole range of artists, African-American, African artists or North African artists who were in Paris during the time. And that will cover a bigger period, but just FYI, we're planning on doing a program in early May with the Pompidou together at the Villa Albertine to look at some of the overlaps between the two shows.
Yeah. And Deborah, what about for you? What does this open up for you?
Oh my God, I think that this, this project has suggested so many potential writing projects, if not exhibitions. As Lynn mentioned, I mean, there are figures who are so underknown in this exhibition that I hope other people actually will also begin to focus on, who should be worthy of deeper examination.
Yeah, wow. Well, I don't know, I think we're maybe ready to move on to questions, unless do either of you have any other kind of final thoughts that you want to convey before we open up to questions?
No, I just want to encourage everybody to come by and see it. 7 years of works, our newer galleries. We have bathrooms, we have lockers. It's an entrance hall gallery. We're able to show parts of our permanent collection. So it's exciting. Yeah, we're collaborating with many different departments at NYU to present a range of programs that are again on our website. So it's exciting to get feedback, and we're continuing to learn. As Deborah said, Oscar Chilensky is one of the artists in the Salon section, and I didn't realize how close he was to Brancusi, and that he was also a president of this, Studio Wheat, Gallery Wheat.
Right.
And learning more about the academies themselves and how they functioned, is of interest. So there's many, many, many avenues.
Yeah, and just, the kind of wonderful anecdotal evidence that is beginning to surface post research, post publication, post exhibition. I heard from a colleague the other day who has worked extensively on Michel Foucault, and he said, did you know that Michel Foucault used his royalties from his first book to buy a painting by Mark Tobey in Paris?
Wow.
Like...
All right. So I think, Eleanor, we can go back to you and to questions, open it up.
Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. The exhibition is really, really, really amazing. So everyone should definitely go see it. We do have some questions from the audience today. And our first question will be from GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so very, very much, Eleanor. Thank you, everyone, for filling in this history. There's so many wonderful bits to know about. A question is, can you in the panel, anybody comment on how Paris was sort of bound up with the ideal of aesthetic escape? Beyond obviously the ability for them to go over with the GI money. But was that much of a draw, the ideal of the aesthetic escape?
I'm not sure I know what you mean by the ideal of
In other words, the sort of romantic or maybe not romantic idea that this is like art, this is freedom, this is this is something to really be drawn to?
Sure. No, I think, a number of the GIs were blown away when they went to Paris, and I mean, there's some statements in the book when you see the book and you see the different excerpted interviews. A lot of them say it was Paris. It was romantic. Paris is a romantic city. Who wouldn't want to spend time in Paris? I think that was one big draw, that it was mythic. And the other thing is the history, you just sense the history, centuries of history, and, centuries and centuries, going back to the Roman baths, going to the cathedrals. There is a reason people, and the light. I mean, a lot of the artists remarked on the amazing light that Paris is known for.
Thank you, GE, for that
Thank you.
question. Thank you, Lynn.
Sure.
Your next question is from John. John, I will allow you to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Looks like a great show. I'm looking really forward to seeing it. My question is, did the U.S. consulate stay aware of the GI Bill artists in Paris? And did they have any obligation to document their activities? Maybe at the end of their stay, write up a report or... So that's my question.
Well, the American Embassy had a remarkable woman, Dorothea Spire, who was the equivalent of a cultural attaché, who became very, very integrated in the expat community of American artists and writers. And after she leaves the American Embassy, she'll actually open her own gallery in Paris. Such was her commitment. But she herself was also either a conduit or single-handedly organized many exhibitions of these artists' work at various places.
Yes, and I think, there was a kind of bookkeeping aspect where somebody from the embassy would come around monthly, maybe, I'm not sure, and check off, who was in attendance, because the GIs were aware that they had to demonstrate that they were indeed attending classes, even if it wasn't every day or for most of it. So there's comments about that, again, firsthand, first source material. And then there was also the American Center in Paris, which had been really important and took on even more importance, I think, in the 60s and 70s in terms of bringing artists over. And there were a couple of shows that Americans, tried to do, or a couple of galleries would try to do. So I think the actual, what those galleries were, who actually showed with them, there's more research to be found. We started keeping track of all the names of, the artists that we came across, and, what years and what galleries or what kind of document we had. And we have over 250 names, and I'd love to be able to get a digital humanities grant so that, we could figure out where the artists lived and, who they interacted with, and get, again, an impetus for more research to figure out, exactly how these various schools and various private ateliers worked.
I just wanted to, just a quick follow-up. This was, of course, in America, the era of McCarthyism. Was there, was there any McCarthyite suspicion about the GI Bill, grantees?
Not that we're aware of.
Okay,
I mean,
thank you.
I think the spirit of McCarthyism was an impetus, certainly at the beginning, for Al Held, who kind of, and we actually thought at the beginning more of the artists were reacting against McCarthy than it turned out to be the case, But one of the, 2017, when we had the Inventing Downtown show up, was also the first year Trump was was elected. And I was wondering, oh, are there going to be more artists fleeing the US, because of the ultra nationalism that Trump was promoting? So still lots of questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Those were great questions. Thanks, Deborah and Lynn, for those answers. Our next question is from Chloe. Chloe, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation, Deborah, Lynn, and Eleanor. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. I am curious, with a project of this scale, and you touched on it a little bit in terms of your personal relationships with the show, but I'm curious, as you were researching for this exhibition, what were the strands of the narratives that you didn't get to cover in this show? Can you just give us a bit of a taste of just a few of the things that you found that you couldn't cover because of just everything else that you so generously covered for us in the exhibition?
Well, we do in the exhibition catalog draw on the literary scene quite extensively, as well as the music scene. We have a really wonderful essay by Rashida K. Braggs, on the various jazz forums in Paris during the early 50s for the most part. There's only one area I think that we didn't cover, Lynn, and that was dance and choreography. But
yeah, I was just going to say that as well. I mean, we ran a little bit out of steam, but again, it's such a rich scene, and there's so many kind of interactions and so many different lenses you can take to look at the scene from different vantage points. But the jazz scene, we had a wonderful graduate assistant who ended up writing a chapter about film and how Hollywood interpreted this period. And, obviously Americans and Parents makes reference to Vincent Minnelli and his film and Fred Astaire. And New Wave was starting, and so there was a back and forth. We have a wonderful, wonderful film by Melvin Van Peebles that's in the Salah section. A short film, and that's another filmmaker that will be examined at Film Anthology. We'll have an evening devoted to them at Film Anthology Archives, along with Carmen Davino, who was a photographer, but also a sculptor and a painter, and who, while working for the Army, filmed the GIs marching into Paris on the liberation, but who's also filmed the artists, a number of the artists, 4 or 5 artists from the Galerie Wheat, about their everyday lives in Paris, and how different it was from New York. So, there are, again, all these, different paths you can go down, and we're hoping that others will be inspired to do so.
Thank you. Thanks for answering my question.
That was a great question. Thanks so much, Chloe. Our final question today will be from Fong. Fong, if you'd like to unmute, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lynn, Debra, and Eleanor. This is fabulous. I was in and out, but I will re-listen again, for sure. I remember when you remember Gibbo book came out in 85, How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. And I remember reading our friend Thomas Lawson, I was still in college then, quite a negative review of the book. And while listening to you talking about how fabulous rich culture Paris is, with the Louvre, with food and whatnot, it's hard to compare American donut to French croissant or bagel to baguette. Go on and go on and go on. But the interesting thing about is that when I grew up in Vietnam, in Hue, it was a very strange time because of the tail end of the French who've been there already 200 years. So I grew up listening to François Hardy, to people like Johnny Hallyday and so on. And they were trying to do equivalent of what American pop or rock and roll is, or British rock and roll. And until I came in encounter what British rock and roll really sound like and American rock and roll sound like, I realized a huge difference. If you take that into the context of taste, of aesthetic, it's so interesting, because this is the question to you, because when you think about Atung and Metier and group of people in France was trying to experiment what New York school were doing.
Well, that's a really, really good question. And you bring up a fact that we haven't touched on, is that in our salon section, we include some paintings by Mathieu and Masson and Vols, because we wanted to provoke more of a dialogue, not just to say, here, the Americans came and this is what they did, but to say that there was, a conversation going back and forth. And there was a new school of Paris, and the Americans learned from that, and then the French learned from the Americans. I mean, it's never just one way. But then you find individually, these artists like Bernard Childs or Alfred Russell is picking up somewhat, aesthetically what the French are doing in taking it in new, very valid directions, some beautiful, beautiful artworks. And then you have other artists like Bill Haywood Rivers, who's an African-American artist who goes to Paris and sticks to what he knows. He paints African-American genre scenes like, barbershops. And we have, a painting that he did for the Gallery Wheat that is in the show next, and we have documented photography of that. So, it's as diverse as any scene is ever going to be. But there are lots of overlaps and new encounters and different kinds of exchanges where, they take what they need to take at that moment, or respond to an aspect. Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, I was also just thinking, I mean, there were a couple of very noted French writers during this period who were very responsive to the American expat scene. One of them I've mentioned, Michel Tapier, who paired Toby with Vols, who's also in our salon section, thinking these were the two prominent figures who would direct en formal. And then there is the eminent French historian / critic, Georges Dutuy, who will become very, very close to Sam Francis and to Norman Bloom and to some of the other figures in this exhibition who were deeply interested in what the Americans were up to and integrated them into their discussions of the international context for art.
And then finally, I mean, I think, another big, overall theme that you see in the artists when they're talking about their experience is just the notion of what a French lifestyle is, which is spending 2 or 3 hours in a cafe talking and meeting, and then eating a good lunch, and being introduced to another lifestyle and appreciating the wine and appreciating, and delighting in that, which wasn't so apparent in the, in the US in the 50s when I was growing up. So, I think it's a win-win. You go abroad, you learn different ways, and you appreciate what you also have at home. We know that for sure that the artists, I think, returning really appreciated American art pedagogy more than they did the very strict traditional academic teaching methods that were still dominant in France at the time.
Super true. Yeah. In the case of Shirley Jaffe, it's clearly that she had maintained her lifelong working as an artist there, and the Parisian modernism, or that Pacificness in that local Parisian community and with everything else, is certainly revealed in her work, as opposed to those return, whether Al Hale or Elvis Kelly. The pragmatic approach towards art making is so far different as soon as they came back in the following decade or more.
Yeah.
But
You know,
yeah,
Shirley Jaffe, however, wanted to return home to the United States, but she couldn't afford to live in New York.
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I guess we can dedicate this to our late friend Irving Sandler, Triumph of American Art, 1970. That was never his intention. That was an editor decision to give the book such title in order to sell it. Anyway, thank you so much. Eleanor, thank you for the moderation. Debra, then Lynn, congratulations. And we have to go see the show.
Definitely. Lots of room for conversation within the show.
To be continued, absolutely. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
The
you.
Rail team, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Fong. That was such a great question and a great note to end on. And just a huge thanks again to Debra, Lynn, and Eleanor for the wonderful conversation today. And congratulations on the incredible exhibition. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and for supporting our archive, which you can explore on the Rail's YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. So consider supporting our work through a link in the chat. And join us tomorrow if you're free at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Emily Cheng, Mel Chin, Bing Lee, Jennifer Samet, and Eugenie Tsai on the occasion of Godzilla, Echoes from the 1990s Asian American Arts Network. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in today to such a great dialogue. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thanks so much again for being here.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debra.
Thank you.
Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks,
Thank
Lynn.
you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Eleanor. Thank you, Debra.
Everyone.
Congratulations.
It's open. The show. Go see it.
Yes, go see the show, everybody.